Okay, everybody, we're about to get started. First, thank you all for coming, and I'm glad you heard about this event since it's outside of our regular program schedule. I'm Summer, I'm the curator here at the museum. First, everybody please take a second to turn off or silence your phones so we don't have any disruptions. As for announcements, tonight is the first of our Hispanic Heritage Month programs. Our next program is on the 17th. It's the opening of our new temporary exhibit called the Cuba Connection, which is a juried exhibit of contemporary Cuban art. And Berta Arias will be the speaker at the Third on Third lecture for that event, and she'll talk about the unique connection between Fernandina and Cuba. The exhibit will run through early December, and then we'll cap it off with a brown bag lunch with Steve Limberg, who will talk about his photography of Cuba. So that'll be on December 1st, and you can see the events laid out there. On September 18th, the day after our exhibit opening, we'll have Fiesta de Santa Maria at the Farmers Market, which will include Hispanic music, living history, and performances. So we hope to see you at all of these events. Again, the details are right there. And then our next brown bag on October 6th will be with John Royal from the St. Mary's Tall Ship Alliance, who will talk about the history of tall ships. And we are going to be participating in Falling for Shrimp on October 1st through the 3rd. So just like Shrimp Fest, we'll have a booth outside the Palace. So come see us for that or sign up to volunteer. So that's it for announcements, but I'd like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program, which is the first of our 3 Florida Humanities Florida Talks lectures for 2021. These programs are a partnership between the Florida Humanities and the Amelia Island Museum of History. Funding for this program was provided by Florida Humanities and sponsored in part by the State of Florida, Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture. Tonight's speaker is Magdalena Lamarre. Magdalena Lamarre was a full professor of history and sociology at Miami-Dade College until her retirement in 2016. She earned a BA in history and secondary education from Hunter College, an MA in history from Stony Brook University, and did postgraduate work in sociology and education at Florida International University. During her tenure at MDC, she co-produced 3 oral history documentaries. She was awarded the prestigious Miami-Dade College Alumni Association Endowed Teaching Chair in 2011 and the NISOD Excellence Award in 1994 and 2012. So everyone, please welcome Magdalena.
Hello. Hello. Let me get myself settled here. Let's take this off, I think. Welcome, and thank you so much for inviting me. Let's hope that we can get this technology. I'm going to take this and I'm going to move it because I need to see because I don't have the computer in front of me. Always something to put this way. I can see the audience, see the screen, and not end up with a stiff neck. Okay. Again, welcome to my presentation. Let's go to the side. If it works. And it's not moving at all. Before it just kept moving.
Press it again.
All right. Welcome to the presentation. As you can see from the title, we're going to be examining some of Florida's early history, focusing on the links to the Caribbean. Amelia Island and Fernandina Beach, in fact, constitute the northernmost city of Florida's Atlantic coast, as you well know. And from the 16th to the 19th century, it served as a crossing point between the British and later American territories to part of the then Spanish Empire. Communities from across that frontier and Florida, especially this region and the coastline, are very much linked through history. And there's aspects of their history that we're going to see that are very intertwined. So Amelia Island's history is this history too in part. Okay, we're going to start with a tour of the Caribbean. Maybe I'm not facing it. Okay, we played it a few seconds ago. Let's get a little mood feeling here.
Down the way where the nights are gay and the sun shines deep.
I'm sure a lot of, or everyone here, remembers the original playing of this song, maybe. I know I did. And this was a big hit, right? It's probably one of the earliest of the crossover music of another culture that made it big. So this beautiful sound here that we're seeing, this beautiful scene that we're seeing in these sounds, for me, definitely bring to mind a Caribbean setting. But this is also a Florida setting because we're in an island, but we're on the coastline, and we're very close to all of these areas. If any of you here are from the Caribbean, as my fellow Caribs will attest, it definitely brings to mind these sunsets, and it kind of even develop a little nostalgia. Although I was not born in the islands. I do have Caribbean ancestry. My parents came from Puerto Rico in 1948, part of that massive migration after the war. So I do have Caribbean ancestry. And myself and my 4 siblings were born in New York, but we were raised within that culture. Eventually, we all moved to Florida. Much like many Caribbean immigrants in this community in general, where we have a lot of diversity and a lot of mixing, and that's my family. My husband is Haitian, Pierre Lamarre, and I have a Jamaican brother-in-law. So we have these Haitian, Puerto Rican, Jamaican, Puerto Rican, island, Trinidad mix, just in our family. We are that Caribbean diversity. But definitely when I hear that song, even I feel like this warmth and this feeling of time. Now, who exactly was this song? It's our friend, Belafonte. He was born in Harlem, New York. He is the son of Caribbean-born immigrants. He's Jamaican. This song actually launched his career and it mainstreamed Caribbean music for that time frame. In the 50s, he introduced the audiences to what's called Calypso music. Now, Calypso is actually from Trinidad. It's not from Jamaica. But again, the music is very similar. His breakthrough album, Calypso, became the first LP that then to sell over 1 million copies. And this is again in the 1950s. And his album, the album is number 4 on Billboard in the top 100 album list. So even today, this is a sound and a piece of music that has really been around for a long time and is still very recognized by a lot of audiences. He's actually, the Library of Congress, and his song, his music, was actually put in the National Preservation Registry for the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, and artistically significant. This was in 2018. All right. Now, you might have seen this. I'm hitting it.
Point it at the computer.
You may have to move it. This is it, right? I'm sorry. We were going to go to the next tile. She may have to do it manually. Can you do it manually?
Yep.
And these things happen. Technology, the more we learn, the more it doesn't work.
Sorry.
It froze. Okay, you might have seen this ad when they advertised the program. How many of you saw it? Are familiar with it? How many did you know? I was originally going to put where they came from, but then I said, no, let people think about it and maybe say, wow, really? I'm sure that there's a lot of here that you're familiar with. Some of them might have surprised you. Were there any surprises for anybody?
Gary Washington.
Okay, really? All right, interesting. Yeah, Jamaica. Nobody, Sammy Davis Jr. now, when you look at this? Yes, I was surprised. Well, Sammy Davis Jr.'s history is interesting because originally, for many, many years, pretty much until 2003, he was always listed as his mother being Puerto Rican and his father being an African American band player. Well, evidently, he passed that story for certain reasons, conjecture, because this didn't come from him, but he kept that part of his ancestry quiet. He's actually Afro-Cuban. His parents, both his parents evidently were Afro-Cuban musicians, and she was a cabaret dancer. But even when I heard he was half Puerto Rican, I was shocked. And we very often are very unaware of a lot of this ancestry. Clay Thompson, and anybody know Clay Thompson, right? You see here Bahamas, right? Sidney Poitier, well, he's an old time, you know, he was from the Bahamas. Esther Raleigh is going to be very important. She's part of Florida history, actually, a resident here. Jada Pickett Smith, okay, there she is from Jamaica. We have Belafonte. Dubois, I'm going to be talking about him, but Dubois was from the Bahamas and Haiti. And Zoe Saldana, very typical of New York, Puerto Rican and Dominican, all right? So this is a history of the United States. It's a history of diversity, and we have these people that are key players within our society that we don't even realize. We put them in certain categories, but these are individuals that have come from this Afro-Caribbean ancestry. And even among African Americans in the United States, there are many individuals who have family roots in the Caribbean and may not be aware of it, especially if they come from South Carolina, and we're going to see why. If their families came from that area, or if they originally were there from very early, even to the establishment of the Outer Barrier Islands and the Gullah culture, then their families, they originally came from the Caribbean. So these links are very, are there. And we have here directly, I'm sorry, I forgot her name. Rice from the Policy Council. The Condoleezza Rice is related to her, and Condoleezza Rice's family is identified as only South Carolina, where she is identified as coming from Jamaica. So when we look at this period of the culture, next slide, we're looking at individuals that have come from many islands and have created this new identity, the American one. We're going to now start looking at the Afro-Caribbean. When we talk about the Afro-Caribbean, we're specifically looking at this area of culture in the Caribbean, of all of these islands that form this massive archipelago. And we're talking or referring to individuals that came here from Africa or have an ancestry of Africa. And I'm not going to say slaves because not all of them were slaves. We're going to see that there's two sides to that story. But the program will focus on certain groups. We're going to be looking at the Cuban community, Afro-Cubans, the Bahamians, the Jamaicans, and Haiti. There are many more stories to tell, but we would be here forever. So many of these individuals came here, and some of them came directly, we'll see, but some of them came arrived here in a roundabout way from the Caribbean. So we're going to examine this early settlement, and we're going to be meeting individuals that some of them were enslaved Africans, but many of them were actually free. Now, the Spanish, after they claimed this region, Florida, they weren't much interested in it because it didn't give them the gold they needed. And there was complaints that it was full of these monsters called alligators, and it was swampy, and the mosquitoes. The natives didn't want to work, that there was no access to anything. So when they started hearing stories, of course, of Mexico and Pizarro and Peru, that's what they wanted, that kind of gold, that kind of instant wealth, which, you know, Florida was not going to give them. So Florida was pretty much ignored, and the Spanish Empire almost let it go. I'm going to see why they didn't. But Florida did serve a purpose even from this beginning, and that's that point that I told you about it being a crossroads. Because from the beginning, one thing that Florida will be for the Spanish is a buffer zone between the Spanish Empire and the British. And it's going to be a military garrison. There were actually 3 garrisons. We have San Marcos and St. Augustine, but we also had St. Mark's and St. Mark's and the one in Pensacola, another one in Pensacola. But there were 2 that a lot of people don't know about. Fort Mose, which is now being reconstructed, which was a black fort, part of the Spanish, and the Negro Fort, which was on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico under Pensacola area. And this is in the area of what they used to call the free towns or the Negro towns. One of the most famous in that region, near Bradenton, was Angola. And again, we're going to look at them more later, but these were free towns created by Maroons, and we'll see who Maroons are, but these were runaway slaves. Now, when the Caribbean islands were settled, we're going to start with the Spanish settlement. But within the Spanish settlement, we're going to meet certain individuals. Next slide, please. We're going to meet certain individuals, and these are the black explorers. Very often, we don't listen to history completely, or we miss little things about them, and we miss individuals, and sometimes they're just not recorded. I looked at the registry of Ponce de Leon's ship, and the only thing it said about Ponce de Leon was that he had 2 Africans. Everybody else was named, but there were 2 free Africans on his expedition. No names. We do know the name of one, we're going to meet him later, But there's a lot of history here that has not been put down in the books and that now we're kind of recovering. So the black explorers are going to play a major role in this early history. We're going to learn more about this gentleman, but this comes from Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's memoirs. And his memoirs were incredible in the story that he tells. But the story is about, in many ways, this person known as Estebanico. Next one. Now, there were people in all of these ships that came, all of these expeditions that were of mixed ancestry. Some of them were called Moors, and they were from North Africa, who had lived in Spain for a period of time. And they would have been there probably since the Arab takeover of Spain in 711. They refer to them as Moros still, or the term Moro refers to a dark-skinned person from this region. They will be Muslim. Some of them will be Arab, coming from Saudi Arabia, that region. Some of them will be Berbers from North Africa. So you have this group coming in. And as a result, you have a mixture right there. These people, if they were in Spain, some of them might have been slaves. They might have been caught, captured during the wars of reconquest, and some of them might have been born free. One of the individuals that we're meeting now is this person, Pedro Alonso Niño, and you see what his fame is. He was the pilot of Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria. Now, he is an example of that mixed, or that North African identity. And you can see from his features in the second part that while he has Africanized features, he also has features that are more maybe Europeanized, right? He's got that mix, because that's what you have in Northern Africa, north of the Sahara. The picture on top has been displayed. I think it's a picture of Columbus, but they've linked it to him. But they used to paint people to look like key people that they were associated with. I really believe that the second one is a more accurate rendition of who he was. Now, what made interesting about him is he was a free man of African ancestry who sailed with Columbus and was one of the first individuals to come to the Americas. So one of the first persons to come to the Americas and explore was a person of African ancestry. Now, one of his brothers owned the second ship, the Niña. He not only was a captain, he was the owner of the ship. His family was ship owners, so they financed part of this expedition, and there were actually 4 brothers. Now, he has been recorded as coming at least on 2 of the trips, all right, with Columbus. Next one, we're going to go to Ponce de Leon. Let's meet Ponce de Leon's trip. Now, we know Ponce de Leon, his first expedition to Florida. You can see the trip. Oh, I don't have the marker. You can see the trail that he took, pretty much following Columbus's trip. He was a Spanish explorer and explorer. He was a conquistador. He was actually part of Columbus's second expedition. So he arrived in the Americas as part of Columbus's crew, and then came back to do his own exploration and conquest. In 1502, he participated in the conquest of Hispaniola, current day Santo Domingo and Cuba. Santo Domingo and Santo Domingo in Haiti. And he then becomes the governor of Puerto Rico. He's removed from the governorship of Puerto Rico by Diego Columbus's son, because he claimed that he was supposed to have all of these islands, and he was supposed to be the viceroy of all of these territories. This was part of the deal in the original exploration. So he now is told by the king, Ferdinand, to continue his explorations and to go into that northern area and to explore the islands of gold in Bimini. So Bimini, right? This is what he's looking for, because there's stories of gold. They don't know where it's coming from, that there's stories of more gold. So he's given this job, and he explores the coast of Florida. And he will then set sail in 1513. And when we look at, as I mentioned, when we look at his manifest, he had one woman, which is the first European woman to record it, because again, we don't have all of the records intact, but the first European woman recorded to come to the Americas, the mainland, would have been Juana Ruiz. And then we have on the list that 2 persons of African ancestry were part of his crew. And no name is given, but they were free. That claim, that statement is made. This was important to be distinguished. It was like a class system or caste system. Other documentation indicates there were more members of the crew that were enslaved Africans. With him is this person, and he's going to be very significant in the history, because he's going to be not only an explorer and a conquistador like many Africans, persons of African ancestry, slave, and free came to the Americas as conquistadores. This was a way to win their freedom, to gain wealth, to leave the conditions in wherever they were in Europe, especially in Spain and Portugal. He is the first person of African ancestry documented. Again, we don't know, came before, set foot in the continental United States. He was free, and he's one of those individuals that we mentioned in that manifest. He traveled with Ponce de Leon. He actually arrived the same way that Ponce de Leon did. First came to Hispaniola, then to Puerto Rico, and then to Florida. After the expedition, they come back to Puerto Rico, where he settles for a time. We know that Ponce de Leon did another attempt to colonize, and he's attacked by the natives, and he dies in Cuba. So that expedition is done. So he goes back to Hispaniola. So at this point, he wasn't born in the Caribbean, but you see how in the roundabout way he is becoming an Afro-Caribbean. Now, what makes him interesting, besides being free, is that he will then proceed to go on a next expedition. And he will go on an expedition with none other than Cortez to Mexico. He was one of the conquistadores that participated in the conquest of Tenochtitlan. And we see here in these two depictions, you see him walking because he wouldn't have had a horse, even if he was, unless you bought your own equipment and your own horses. And horses were very, very precious and valuable at this time. They're just being reintroduced into the Americas. But you see him here with Cortez, you see him carrying a weapon, and you see that there's some Africanized features, different from the picture that we saw before. But what's important here is that he was depicted in these prints as having been part of Cortez's meeting with Montezuma. Now, there were enslaved Africans that were part of this expedition when Cortez first comes to Mexico, and it is believed, it's been documented, that one of them was sick with smallpox. And that may be how smallpox was first introduced into Mexico City when Cortez first enters. Can we go back a slide a second? Back to, here we go. Okay, I want you to look at the two pictures. This is supposed to be him. You can see here on this one on the side, they're both in the Spanish garb, but this one shows him more having the North African features. However, he was from Angola. He's documented as having come from Angola. And I believe that the first picture is more likely a true rendition. Because he would have been from the south of the Sahara, not the north. So he would have had the more Angolan features. Now, also his clothing. We know about him so much because he actually petitioned the king for a pension as a conquistador after 30 years of service for the crown. He didn't get it. He did get some land, but he did. He didn't get it, but he did get some land. He did get land. He did get married in Mexico. He had family in Mexico City. He's credited with being the first person to grow wheat in the Americas. And the second one would show him in his dress of that time of a person who owned property. And again, Spanish attire. So I believe that the first is his correct rendition.
Do we know how much land he was given?
Probably in the records, but I didn't focus on his history. But it was enough to grow wheat. It was, and it was the tracts of land that were given during this period were very large. Nothing, they didn't all, the families, and some families still hold them in places like in Mexico. Yes, they do. All right, so then when we go here is the next one, right? We have, so we have, the next person we have here is Esteban. Now he was a slave, so that's what distinguishes him from Garrido. Where Garrido was a free man, he was an enslaved African. He's the first documented enslaved person of African ancestry to explore the continental. We're going to see his expedition and what he traveled on foot, but he really did do the first exploration of the Americas. He was part of an expedition that was started by Panfilo de Narvaez in 1527. He set sail with more than 400 men. By the time that we hear the story of Estebanico and the expedition, there are 5 of them who have survived their arrival in Florida. Their ship is destroyed, their supplies are destroyed. Narvaez, I think, is killed. Cabeza de Vaca is there, Dorantes, his master, is there. Estebanico, and I don't remember the other 2 gentlemen. But then they are captured by the Indians, by the Native Americans, and they are enslaved. And now they're going to work and be in this time frame for a couple of years, actually walking. So when we meet him, we see him going from the Caribbean into Florida, right? Off, I think on the West Coast Tampa is where the ship crashed. It was destroyed. I think it was a storm. So between the storm and not having supplies and then not having friendly relations, because by now there have been other expeditions and the Native Americans are not very accepting of people coming, the expedition was in trouble. So what they'll do is they will be captured and they will start this trek by moving through this area, through the southern area of the United States. Next slide, please. And this is his trip. This was done by walking, except, the ship part. But they believe he landed in Tampa Bay. They will then try to go to Galveston, and they didn't make it. They built some rafts. Then they will go along the coastline and they will walk into this whole region. This was a walking trek. So when this expedition is over, again, there's only 5 people left. They credit the expedition's success with him. He was very familiar with herbal natural healing, so he was seen as a great healer. He was always also very good at acquiring languages, so he was their interpreter. Very often he would be sent ahead, and he learned at least 5 languages. There may have been more because all of these tribes here did speak different languages. And today more research is being done and he's being given more credit that he probably is the reason that the 5 of them survived, because of his ability to interact and translate and heal during that period. Now, they're going to cross, this expedition is going to cross, I'm trying to get quickly for the time, the length, and I can't. All right, he made his way to the southwestern corner eventually of the United States 46 years before the first English people arrived. So we see that he goes all the way into Mexico City after this expedition. He's then sold to the Viceroy of Mexico City. He goes up to Cibola looking for the cities of gold. He does this the year before Coronado. And we don't know. The story is he got killed. The other story is that he may have just disappeared. He just, blended in. Eventually, this exploration was documented by Cabeza de Vaca. So that's how we know his story, because we have someone who was part of the expedition who wrote it in his memoirs. And this is a reason that a lot of this information is lost to history, that no one documented it. Let's go to our next slide, all right? Now, these are 2 books if you're interested. The first one is the original account. The second one is a more current rendition. You see here he's given more African features. And his contribution to history is now being recognized. And he's being recognized as an explorer, which is what he basically was during this time. Next slide, please. We're going to now go into the mass trafficking of Afro-Caribbean peoples, because the arrival of Africans to the Americas, unfortunately, for the most part, will be one of slavery. Although we have already addressed that there were free individuals, that's not the reality for many of them. So when we look at this particular area, we're going to focus on that. And I wanted to look at this part here and notice that statement. Again, this is an effort today to really watch what we say. Language can display or just depict a certain message. So rather than calling them slaves, right, we focus on using a language of enslaved Africans, because not all Africans were slaves. Only the people that were captured and sold into slavery would have been slaves. And I love this quote because it really brings to light this idea that slavery is not a natural condition. It's something that you are forced into. From 1501 until 1518, the transatlantic slave trade was comprised of enslaved black persons who were transported from Iberia. You could only bring baptized slaves to the Americas, and they had to speak Spanish. That was one of the conditions. And there was a limit because Portugal was in charge of the slave trade, not Spain. So they had to be very careful that they did not infringe on Portugal's right to the slave trade at this time. So when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, we first must look at Portugal, because for 200 years we're going to see they dominate. And then the Dutch will get involved, and finally it will be the British. So this is why most of the explorers that we found, and even the earlier enslaved Africans in the Americas, they're going to be people of African descent, but basically known as Moors or Berbers or Arab Muslims. And this is, again, why we have both free and enslaved people in America. Now, when we look at this age of exploration and settlement, we have a number of individuals that are going to participate in the enslavement of Africans that are Africans themselves. Please keep that in mind, that we do have that part of history too. And when we talk about the history of Portugal's involvement, this was a relationship that was held between Portugal and later the British and the Dutch with African leaders, right, from different areas of Africa. Next. When we look at the slave trade, as I mentioned, it's going to be focusing here. We see the focus is on the coast of Africa, and you see that it's like a triangle, and there's Brazil, because the slave trade was focused in the hands of the Portuguese. They will be the major transporters. You see, estimated 4.5 million Africans by themselves that they transported into slavery. But what's even more significant is that 40% of them went to Brazil, because Brazil is going to be like a midway station. That's what we mean about the part of the Middle Passage. The triangular trade refers to the way the goods moved, because slaves were considered goods. So depending on if you were transporting the slaves, with guns, raw materials, manufactured, the triangle will move in different directions. The smallest number at this period, the smallest overall number of enslaved Africans coming as part of the slave trade was actually to the Americas. Right? Dr. Gates calculated, calculations based on that time, that basically only about 388,000 enslaved Africans were actually sent from Africa to North America, to the English colonies. Most of them went to Latin America, and as we can see, most of them actually ended up going to Brazil. Now, when they go into Brazil, they're going to be kept in Brazil because Brazil will engage in sugar plantations, but they're also going to be now sent out, because this becomes a port of entry for enslaved Africans. It becomes a depot or a market or an area of conditioning, culturating, getting them ready to accept their fate. And then they are going to be sold to the Caribbean. And it is from the Caribbean that they come out. From Trinidad, that's going to be a station. Jamaica is going to be a major station. And Barbados is going to be actually, as small as the island is, the major area in which we will have slaves brought in and taken out. And slavery in the United States, the model of plantation slavery that we have, will come out of Barbados. Okay, you can see here the numbers, how big, you know, you really see the majority of the travel or the transport by the size of the markers. And again, Brazil is going to be the primary, but you see the dispersal into the Caribbean. Right here we'll see the markers of Jamaica, Barbados, and Trinidad. And we can kind of understand why this is the process, because we have here on the Trinidad access to Brazil. We have them moving into Barbados. The first islands the British will take from the Spanish. Barbados was very small, however, they will establish plantations there. And it actually contained a very large white population. And then we have Jamaica taken from the Spanish, and then they will be used as a post, a place where they will jump off into slavery. Now, when we look at Barbados, from Barbados will be taken, planters will be recruited by South Carolina. Remember I mentioned the South Carolina connection? From South Carolina, the proprietors of South Carolina are given a grant by the king, and they want to develop a colony. And what they're looking at is a model, and they realize that the perfect model may be Barbados, because this tiny island, really, if anybody is familiar with Barbados, it's one of the Lesser Antilles, is producing sugar and is flourishing. And it has a very wealthy plantation class, and it also has other groups in the society that may not be landowners, but that are moderately well off, educated, and prepared to engage in this process. So they recruit them to come and bring the model of the plantation into South Carolina. And that's where we get the plantation system in the United States. And of course, not only will they come, they'll come with their slaves. And as the plantation system in South Carolina develops, which will be not sugar, because sugar was not conducive, it will be rice. That's going to be one of them. And later we'll have tobacco and cotton, but rice is going to be the important one. Then they'll need more slaves. And this is why Barbados now is exporting slaves. It becomes that way station. Now it's a way station for the British, because they will have taken over the African, transatlantic African slave trade. Right? Let's go to the communities in Florida. These communities in Florida basically were all Maroons. You know what Maroons are? You heard the term? Escaped or runaway slaves. This was the form of black resistance that enslaved Africans had. So when we talk about Maroons communities, we're talking about individuals that have left a great peril, and many of them didn't survive. They have left their situation of enslavement and sought freedom. Many of them will go west, wherever they were, and go in with the native tribes, and will be taken in by the tribes, because the native tribes, many of them had also been enslaved. And as they're losing land, they're going to be allies with these individuals who are trying to break away from these plantations and from this spreading over into the western areas. But you have a lot of them that come to Florida for a different reason, because Florida will become this doorway of freedom for them. Now, when we look at the period of Maroon history in Florida, there were a lot of Maroon communities. There was actually a lot of Maroon or free towns or black towns. One of the largest settlements was Angola, called Angola, toward Bradenton. Those will not survive past the United States acquisition of Florida when it became a territory in 1819. And what we will have is the destruction of these free towns because they were enslaved people who had run away. And at this point, the United States has slavery. They consider these runaway slaves, and their goal is to destroy these towns and recapture these people, and that's what they did. But they also took with them two people who had lived 2 or 3 generations already in this area. We're talking about the 1800s, and these Maroon communities are going to start 1500s already, who had been born free for 2 or 3 generations who were sold into slavery. So the Maroons are going to be a history of Florida, and these are the first Afro-Caribbean people. These may be the first. This was an early expedition by the Spanish in 1526. They arrived in South Carolina to start because all this region was claimed by the Spanish. They couldn't hold on to it, but they did claim it. Only under 150 survivors of 700 colonists went back to the Dominican Republic, because this was a jumping point. 100 enslaved Africans did not return with them. What happened? They ran away. That's all they know. That's all that's recorded. We don't know where they went, who they went with, but they do know that these individuals did not return with the survivors of the expedition. Partly it was fighting with the natives, illness on the part of the expedition. Once a young died, there was no leadership, so they couldn't hold on to them. But we have probably what may be the first Maroon community in the mainland United States. Let's go. But the most important Maroon community and the real start of the Afro-Caribbean community is going to be Fort Ponce. Right? This was a fort that was established after St. Augustine was built. This particular castillo took about 10 years to build, but it included labor that were free and enslaved, but it included also Africans that were free, that were part of the militia. As you can see, in the city itself, 20% of the population was already black. So this was a large portion of the community. 1 out of every one of them was a free black person. So they weren't all enslaved. St. Augustine, even then, was called a polyglot. It was made up of all these languages, all these groups, Native Americans, different Europeans, the African Americans, newly arrived slaves, people who had been a long time. So this was an interesting community that St. Augustine had this early environment and mixture. And probably this occurred because it served as a garrison, as a buffer. So its purpose was very different. And as long as they worked to defend, right? As long as they worked to defend, they fought for Spain, these individuals will be allowed to come into the Americas. What happens here is Florida becomes the first underground railroad because they will flee from South Carolina and Georgia along the coastline because all they know is that they have to reach this fort in Spanish territory on the coast. So you know that one of their passages was probably this area of Amelia Island, because they're going to follow the coastline till they reach their destination. When they reach their destination, right, the first group that was documented was 11 that escaped, and they are accepted because they are here. There's a safe haven. How, we don't know. All right, it's incredible at this time frame that they could hear from the plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, these isolated areas, right, that if they went south, they would be free. And how are they free? The king's edict. The king of Spain, not because he was generous, but because he wanted someone to protect the frontier, and Spaniards did not want to come here. He offered any enslaved person who came, if they agreed to baptism, and if they agreed to serve in the militia, that they would then be free. And that was granted, and we had the development of this area. Eventually, the community continues, to get them. So we're going to actually have the next one. We're actually going to have the development, the establishment of the city of, again, El Pueblo de Gracia Real, Santa Teresa de Mos. Okay, this becomes the black community, and it is a fort. It's one of the forts. Menendez is going to be one of those runaways. He will come in with a group. I think his trip took like 8 years through the jungles. When he arrives, he is given command of the militia, and he does get his freedom, and he gets his own town. That community gets their own town. Fort Mose was their town, their property, their fort. If you look at his outfit, you can see something very interesting. He's got a gun. He was in full uniform. This is remarkable because even free people in the north, right, of African ancestry, even free people could not carry guns or have weapons in public. Right? So here he is, a soldier paid to defend the community. He arrived in 1724 with 9 other enslaved Africans, and after that they continued coming until Fort Mose becomes a community. They do defend the St. Augustine in Florida from the British. When England acquires Florida after the French and Indian War, 1763, they leave because they realize at that point that they would have been enslaved again. They would have been sold into slavery. And they go to Cuba. The whole community from Fort Mose goes to Cuba. You can see it's been reestablished. They were full Spanish soldiers. They were militia, so they dressed as Spanish soldiers. They weren't just like, put together as this, afterthought. They were actually part of the Spanish. They got salaries. They had their own houses, their own community. They were free to move around. Now, out of this community will also grow another group of individuals called the Black Seminoles, because the fact that many of them were married or intermarried with the Native Americans or just had alliances with them will create a different community. So the Black Seminoles still can be found in here, but the Black Seminoles ended up having to leave. Where did they go? Part of that Underground Railroad. They went to the Saltwater Underground Railroad, and they ended up at Andros Island in the Bahamas. That'll be in the 1830s. So the marker this is the Miami Beach, and that's the marker for one of the heritage sites. The lighthouse, when it came, kind of stopped that, but this was their point. And Bohemians would come and take them from this point into Andros Island. Their community was discovered, it's still there. And this community is pretty much still like when they were in the United States. Language, culture, food, music, they are within the Bahamas, but they're not part really of that Bahamian culture. They're a very unique group. Okay, we're going to look at now what's called the diaspora, and this is the moving out, people leaving. And when we talk about the diaspora here, we're talking about individuals that I basically say that it was voluntary, but it wasn't voluntary. Because they will come to the United States seeking opportunities that are not available in their islands. So while these are free individuals who are choosing to come, the conditions at home are going to somebody force them. So when we talk about persons of the diaspora, now we're going to be looking at the other islands that are not part of the Spanish Empire, even though the first group all came from Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Santo Domingo. That's going to be the first wave of the ones brought to Florida. This group of individuals would be people coming from the Caribbean of mostly African ancestry, but also mixed. There's going to be 95 to maybe 40% possibility of full African ancestry. Mixed because you have Europeans, you have Native Americans, you have Chinese that settle here, you have Indians from India that settle, so you're going to have a community that's very diverse. Now, these individuals, all right, represent today 10% of the immigrants to the United States. So of all the immigrants, 4.4 million are Caribbean immigrants. Why do they come? For generations, they have migrated to sustain their societies. And you can see the amount that is sent increasingly. Which are the countries that send the most, all right? Let me see. Dominican Republic, 54% of all money sent to the Caribbean is from them. Jamaica, 21%. Haiti, 20%. So we're talking about communities, and all of the islands have this, communities in the Caribbean that are sustained by family members that leave in order to sustain them. These are the employment sectors, right? And you can see very high in management, service occupations for this community as compared to the other groups. Let's move to the other ones. This is where they live. I think we already know. These are the major cities, but again, you'll notice that Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm, Orlando, Kissimmee, Tampa, St. Pete, right? These are the major cities in Florida. So Florida was and continues to be one of the major receiver cities for immigrants from the Caribbean. The group we're going to look at quickly now are going to be the Afro-Caribbean Hispanics. I want to emphasize that there are Afro-Cubans in Cuba, in the Dominican Republic, and in Puerto Rico. The percentages that you see are much smaller as you go into these areas. It's going to depend on their function during the period in history and how many slaves came. Puerto Rico was a military garrison, had no other wealth, so you had very few slaves brought in. But it still has about, 7.3% individuals that identify as being Afro-Caribbean. The census shows Cubans, persons of Cuban ancestry. In 2019, I don't have the new numbers yet to update this, but this is the persons of Cuban ancestry. Is the largest group living in Florida, and most of them did come to Florida. The Cuban community historically has always had links to Florida, but one of the things we're going to see is massive migrations in two periods. The biggest one you probably know after the Cuban Revolution, but actually the biggest one is going to be another area, Ybor City and Key West. Why? The cigar industry, right? And this is where you're going to have them coming in. And when we look at the individuals who participated in the making of cigars, you can see that 20% of the population in these communities by the mid-80s are going to be black or mulatto, and they're going to be here for that purpose, to work in the cigar industry. Ybor City was the cigar capital. The cigars kind of went out of use with cigarettes, but it still has that history. And when we look at the time frame, 15% of the population, again in '86, were Afro-Cubans. 90% were male, right? Of the male Cubans, they worked as cigar workers. That was the main industry in Ybor. And you also have 15% of the female Afro-Cuban workers in the cigar industry. You do have women working in it, not as much. Mostly they separate. They don't have the job of doing the fine cigars. I wanted us to look quickly at this picture, because look at this picture. What does it tell you? You see this mix in Ybor City, right? In 1899, in Jim Crow South. And they're all together, young, old, Italian, Portuguese, French, Spanish, right? And this is the nature of Ybor City that was very unique in a time when this was unheard of in the United States. It was not acceptable outside of their community, but the fact that this community did exist and live this way was pretty remarkable for them. Okay, we're going to go to Celia Cruz, the Queen of Salsa. What makes her significant? The song? Yeah. Okay. You can stop it. She is probably the most iconic person related to music of Hispanic origin, salsa, in America. It's not, salsa is not only from Cuba, but she is like the representative, the Queen of Salsa, she's called. And this was a stamp that was done for her. So when we talk about the Cuban community, she is one of the most well-known of the Afro-Cuban community. Right. Next one we're going to look at quickly are the Bohemians. They are one of the oldest communities in here. And the reason that they came here is the link to Key West in Florida, and that's going to be the first settlement. What their major role is going to be actually the building of Miami. They worked in the tourism, they worked in the building of the railroad, they worked in when they switched to capitalist agriculture in Miami area, the Florida area, the South Florida area. They were key there. When the hotels were built, they not only built them, but then they're going to be serving in them. They're going to be the maids. They're going to be the butlers. The fact that they're going to play this key role is they spoke English. So this is going to be a major seller for them to be able to function in this capacity. So the Bahamian community has been here for a long time. Most of them do live in Miami. Large percentage of the population, they will continue to live in their original community in Miami. But the oldest one I mentioned already was in Key West. And by the 1870s and 90s, you can see the number, 25,000 people in Key West were Bahamian. That's how large that community was at that time. Next one, please. Permanent settlements, 40% of the population that lived in Miami at this time were Afro-Caribbean, Bahamian. Coconut Grove is the heart of their city, and it still is today. If any of you have been down there, you can still see the community. It's very, the culture, the music, the environment. They still have a segment. You have three groups that lived in that area, by the way. They're kind of connected. You're going to have the Cuban, you're going to have the Bahamian, and you're going to have the Haitian. They basically migrated to that same area. By 1920, they were 52% of Miami's black population. Next one, please. They came in different waves, and I mentioned already that many of them came as part of the labor force to build the city. Bahamas got upset. They were losing their laborers, they were losing their builders. But for the Bahamas, and on the other hand, this was very good because this is money going home. And for the United States, this was good too because they were not competing for jobs with anyone, and then they would leave because they were not here to settle, they were here to work and then go back to their families. Eventually, the situation is going to happen that you're going to have a returned exodus. Bahamas may be one of the few that it becomes a return exodus where many Bahamians go back, because Bahamas will then develop its own tourism industry. And that will become the primary source of income for Bahamians. So you have a lot of Bahamians that traditionally have been here for a long time. They're part of that original wave, and their generations have stayed. And then you have the community that went back and developed it. So you have the split community of Bahamians. But for a long time, it was seen like they could come back and forth easily. And of course, Bahamas are right across, right, from the Keys. So access is going to be one of the key things that are going to contribute to this kind of change. Then I mentioned already that the Bahamas tourism, right? Today tourism is 50% of the Bahamian workforce. So they, to a certain degree, and again, I don't have new numbers after the hurricane and the destruction last year, but for the Bahamas, tourism was a key industry, and this was very important for this community because they're dry. There's not enough land. That's a big problem. And they lived off the sea, but there's a limit what you can get from the sea. They were they would salvage for sunken ships and metal, and also sponge farming. That's why they went to the Bahamas. The characteristics of this population, again, most of them lived in Miami. 29, the high degrees, 39% are have college degrees. Graduate degrees, 35% in business, right? And sales, 27. So this is a very upwardly mobile and highly socially, middle class to upper middle class population. Goombay, this is their celebration. This is not carnival, okay? You probably know this. Okay. Goombay is based to the British Protestant celebration of Christmas time and their slave celebration. It's not linked to carnival. It is different, but it has the costumes, the masks, the drums, the music, and you can go to Junkanoo. It's called Junkanoo in the Keys. You can celebrate Junkanoo and in Miami during the festival. Prominent Bahamians, all right, probably the two most prominent Bahamians in Florida, all right, Congresswoman Frederica Wilson and actress Esther from the Times. Yeah. She lived in Pompano Beach. Dubois, sociologist, NAACP. His grandfather was Bahamian, his father was Haitian. And here's a few others which we already saw, right? You can look them up if you are curious. Let's go to the next one. The Jamaican community is the next major community. Again, this is the oldest in the United States, of Jamaican ancestry, the largest and the oldest. They've been coming here, also part of that early wave, right? That early slaves brought in, but also labor. And they would be brought in from the beginning as different kinds of seasonal workers. They were brought in to work on the Panama Canal. Bahamians also worked on the Panama Canal. But very often Jamaicans are brought in as temporary workers. They're brought in to work in the farms in the South, and they're called swallows because they come like migrant workers and then they fly home. Yeah. A large number of Haitians also are part of this work. For the Haitian community, you have the ones that are stoopers because they're gathering tomatoes and crops low, and what are the reachers because then they're working on the trees. So they give names depending on the kind of labor they engage in. The island was a way station, as we already know. It was a clearinghouse, so that was one of the products or commodities sold. Between 81 and 1914, 90,000 Jamaicans, as you can see, were recruited. A large number to work on the Panama Canal. Again, English. They spoke English. That was going to be a key thing working, with the building of the U.S. canal. The Jamaican, one of the things about the Jamaicans is they were recruited during World War II to replace the American farm workers that had gone to fight in the war. The Mexicans had been sent back during the Great Depression. So even though many of these Mexican workers were actually U.S. citizens because they had been born in Texas or Mexico or Arizona, had been there since the 1500s, but they were sent back during the Great Depression. So when we get to the war, we need workers, so we recruit them. And Jamaicans are still being recruited. They still are brought to do this kind of labor. This is one of the largest groups that comes in. Again, 25% live in Florida. It's not the largest community, but it's a large community. A lot of them live in New York City. This is another popular area. They have one of the highest share of college graduates within the Caribbean community. And again, look at the areas, very high management, professional jobs. Of course, Bob Marley, right? Can't do anything without seeing Marley, okay? We have like 5 minutes. We're going to go through them quickly, but Marley is the icon of Jamaica and culture. Everybody knows his music. And we also have these 3 very prominent now Jamaican Americans, but they were not, there are many more, but these are the ones probably that are most well known today. Kamala Harris, of course, Susan Rice, I can remember her first name, Susan Rice, and Colin Powell. These individuals all have some Jamaican ancestry. Next community we're going to look at is the Haitian community. This community is a little different. It tends to be, you have a mix. You have professional, middle class, business owners, and then you have extremely poor. Then you have that same kind of mixture, class mixture in Haiti. What we get here are both. Many who fled Duvalier during 50s and later, 60s, 70s. These would be from a lot of the professionals, well-educated families. And then you have what we know as the boat people, or the workers that come in as migrant workers. We have them in Bug Lake, there's a large community. In Miami, they work in Homestead. The Haitian community has a long history with us in the United States. What they do is they come to the United States, again, seeking to better themselves. And the tendency for many of these communities to establish their own communities, because it is safer, and to some degree they're also self-isolated. So then the Haitian community in the United States is spread. We have a large community in New York, but Florida also has a large community. It doesn't move right. And these are the different ways. When we look at the community here in Miami, we have Little Haiti, which is kind of an enclave. And I mentioned that they're surrounded. You have Little Haiti, you have the Grove area for the Bohemians, you have Calle Ocho and the Cuban community in downtown. So you have all of these groups that are kind of close together. And then you have Overtown, I forgot the other name there, in Miami, of the African Americans. So when we look at the different waves, we have the political, but we see that a lot of it has to do with economics, not just political. And then disaster. One of the last waves that we had that were given visas were after the earthquake. We don't know what's going to happen with this one because we just had another large earthquake in Haiti in the southern part. The largest cluster I mentioned is in Little Haiti on the Edison and Little River section. They're found in Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Deerfield Beach has a large community. And about today, 7,000 to 10,000 work in agriculture jobs throughout the state. So they are basically working as migrant farmers, but not migrant, because they're located basically in Florida. We have a number of individuals. I chose this gentleman because he was a Haitian Tuskegee airman. A lot of people don't know that they were Haitian members of the Tuskegee, fighters. He is alive. He just turned 100 last September. Oh. Incredible. So last I heard he was alive, so he's going to be 101. He lived in Orlando area of Sanford for a while, and I think he's living in Alabama. And that was a picture taken when he went to get his Medal of Honor, because the Tuskegee Airmen were recognized, and then they got a Medal of Honor from the president. He's the only one that's alive of the Haitian Tuskegee men. Right? I think there's maybe 5 more of the others were still alive. They're very old. Another key point about history in Haiti, the founder, it's not Florida, but I thought it was important to see, he was the founder of Chicago. First one to actually settle in what became the city of Chicago from Haiti. Okay? And another key point, in the Battle of Savannah in 1779, France was an ally of the United States, sent about 500 French militia that fought with the French in the Battle of Savannah. And they originally were supposed to be like maybe just follow them, but they ended up fighting in the battle. And this was built by the Haitian American Society for them. Very quickly, Bookman, a little bit of the Haitian music. Let's hear them. Yeah. Now, one of the things that distinguishes Haiti as a community is the fact that it was the first black republic in North America. It was the first nation to free itself from slavery, right? And well, this person, Bookman, the Bookman experience, they get their name from one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution. So the name that they take from that period, I think it was their high priest or the priest who kind of blessed them and worked with them for the revolution. But the Haitian community is part of Florida integral, right? My husband is Haitian. So I don't know that one a little bit more. I want to just quickly, this is the end, these are distinguished sons and daughters, okay? It's a long list of them, you may know some of them. Roque Puente from Puerto Rico, you know, baseball player, Sammy Davis Jr. now we have, Cuba. We have, we have Malcolm X was from Grenada, well-known people. I'm going to talk about Schomburg in a second. Carl Anthony Towns is the Dominican Republic. And Tonique Williams, Darling from the Bahamas. So Charlie Chisholm, British Guyana and Barbados, right? The last person that I want you to meet, though, I'm going to talk about Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. He's Puerto Rican. I was always very interested in his work. What distinguished him is, first of all, he came to the United States at the turn of the century from Puerto Rico. He was German and African, black Puerto Rican. But what he did was he lived in Harlem and became part of the Harlem Renaissance. And what he dedicated his life to was collecting anything that had been written, painted, stories, collections, art, anything that had to do with the history of both Caribbean black people in the Americas and African American. This is what he dedicated his life. So a lot of this information that I've shared with you today comes out of his massive collection, which today is part of the City University library, the City University Library, and the New York Public Library collection of books in New York City. And again, he was Puerto Rican. Thank you very much. If you want to contact me, if you want any readings, if you're interested in different, there's a lot of stuff that I mentioned here. There's more that I didn't include, but if you want a list of readings, it's my pleasure. I'm the retired professor, but I'll give you something to read. I'll give you homework. You can contact me at this email, which is my email. I can give you a card that I have, which is for a different email, because I'm an educational speaker, but I do another series of speeches, which I use comic books. Yeah, the comic culture and popular culture and the role that comics have played in different parts of our history. So that one has a different email, but I'll give you a card if you're interested. And do we have time for a few questions that you want to ask? Any questions? Anyone? Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little about the division of the Portuguese and the Spanish influence in the Americas? I seem to remember the boats were involved in that.
Yeah, all right. So, well, first question, why the Portuguese? Why did they control the slave trade? Well, at the end of the reconquest of Spain, right, the king and queen are looking for money, a lot of money. Columbus had been going to all the monarchs. He had gone to England, to the king. He had gone to Portugal. The Portugal had already freed themselves during the reconquest, and already in 1441, Prince Henry the Navigator was in charge of the sailing, and the Portuguese have always been sea people because they are peninsula on the coast, so they've always been very familiar with the Atlantic and sailing, very comfortable. They weren't afraid they were going to fall off the earth or, the monsters were going to eat them. They knew the seas. So the Portuguese already had made contact off the coast of Africa, and they are the first ones that will purchase enslaved people. And because of this and contact and the information they get as they go down, right? Eventually Bartolome Diaz crosses the Cape Horn for 1488, I think. So by that point, what happens? They have found the route to Asia, to India by water. Columbus decides he's going to try a new trick because he can't go that way because the Portuguese are already. He proposes going west. He had an idea of how the earth was. He didn't think it was flat. He didn't think it was, He had an idea of its size. It had been calculated like by 2000 something BC by a Greek philosopher, astronomer. Aristophanes. So they knew how big the earth was. Columbus had an idea of how much he was going to have to travel. He had heard that there were islands, so that was his hope, that he would be able to replenish his water and food, because he calculated, and he calculated just right. But he didn't know there was a whole continent there. And the islands that he calculated he would reach would be the outer islands of maybe Japan, or maybe the outer islands of the Spice Islands, which is what he was seeking, which would have been Indonesia. So the Portuguese went west, and they realized they've hit gold. Gold in Africa, gold in trade to the Indies, gold now in the slave trade. And they are the defenders of the faith. That's what it meant to fight the Crusades, to fight the Muslims, right, in the Reconquest. And the Spanish are also defenders of the faith, because they've reclaimed, Spain and made it Catholic. So they go to the Pope. As good Catholics, they go to the Pope and they say to the Pope, listen, you got to help us out here, because we are claiming, anything that Columbus finds by going west, that's ours. And Portugal can have Africa. But they didn't know was that the Portuguese were going to reach Indonesia and India. So the Pope passes the line of Tordesillas, and the Treaty of Tordesillas, the line of demarcation. And what it says is anything east of this line belongs to the Portuguese. That's why they were given permission to control the slave trade, and only they could bring people out of Africa for slavery. And the Spanish were going to be given everything west, which would be the lands they discovered. What happened was the line passed just by the tip of the corner of what is today Brazil. And Pedro Cabral, a Portuguese sailor, got caught in the trade winds by accident and lands in Brazil on that little strip and claims it for Brazil. And because it's in the line of demarcation just as much, doesn't matter, he claims it. Of course, it ended up being this much, right? So that's why they are the only ones in the Americas, not only the only ones that can engage in slavery in the Africa, but the only ones that can engage in slavery in the Americas, because the Spanish are not given that. What the Spanish did is they enslaved the native in Mexico, in Peru, in the Caribbean. The ones that survived were enslaved. Today, they've been doing DNA testing, and it was believed that the Taino population was gone. They did the DNA testing, my sister did it, and we kind of knew this because my grandfather was from the Canary Islands, one of them, that we had Portuguese and Spanish was a high marker, but we had Taino, and we had a pretty high marker, about 7% possibility of Taino, which is incredible, and a very low, like 1% or less of African, but that was there, the African was there, because that's the reality of the Caribbean. Does that answer your question? The line of demarcation. Anybody else? And you can always email me if you have questions. Yes?
You talked about some of the Moors coming over, like some were free, like
the Moors are pretty much all free.
But then you talked about another person who was Moorish that came over, and he was an enslaved person when he got to the Americas. So was slavery not based on race then, and what determined who was a slave?
In Spain, slavery was based on the wars of reconquest and capturing. So during the first stage, the Spaniards were the slaves, because they were the ones captured by the Muslims who invaded Spain. They come in through North Africa. They actually come in through Morocco, that area, North Africa, Berbers, through the Straits of Gibraltar, and they go right into Spain, all the way up to the area, like 2/3 of Spain. And during that period, all the Spaniards that were captured were enslaved. And there was a lot of intermarriage too between them. Then they do cross into the pyramid. They cross the pyramids and they reach France, the famous Battle of Tours, where they're stopped and they're pushed back. At that point is the Reconquest. And the Reconquest starts in the northern third of Spain, and then they push down. That area, even today, is very militant. That's where the Gallegos and the Basque, and you hear about the search for independence. But it comes from always being very independent, very militant, very self-dependent. So at that point, they're the ones capturing the Moors and enslaving them. But we're talking now about 700 years of having lived there. So those lines have been blurred, So you have a lot of these North Africans who were actually born free in Spain, had been born free, who had been there generations. And then you had some that might have been caught recently in the wars of reconquest, because the wars end in 1492. 1491 actually, 1492. So you have the end of the wars in Spain, and Columbus asking for his assistance to sail, searching a route to India. That's one of the reasons the Spanish crown agrees, because if he finds that route, this is going to give massive wealth, control of the trade by water to Spain. This is like, and they need it because they've been fighting for like 700 years to retake over their country. So that's why you have that mix. You'll have free and enslaved. Most of them were recently captured. But they all had to be, they were all baptized, they all had Christian names, they had the name, like Esteban was Esteban Durantes, his owner was, I forgot his first name, Durantes. So they would get baptized, because that was a requirement. In Spain, they required you to baptize them, teach them Spanish, and that's who they wanted. And why would they want them? They don't want newly captured individuals to be slaves, because they're not conditioned, they're not accepting, they haven't accepted their fate, they're not defeated, they haven't been enslaved. They want people who've been enslaved for a long period of time. So that's why they wanted these slaves from Spain, because they had lived under conditions. And in the beginning, it didn't much change. You know, I'm not saying that slavery was not always bad, but the conditions of slavery would become increasingly more difficult and more brutal, as they depend completely on this kind of labor. And when then it targets a population by race, like you mentioned. So even the idea of the conditions of slavery. The first slaves brought to Jamaica, enslaved Africans brought to Jamaica in 1619, actually it looks like they were indentured. There were 20 of them who had been brought from Africa, but were sold in Jamestown, but they gained their freedom, and record talks about 2 of them, their names, married, who finished their tenure and got some land, and then they had their plantation and they had their own slaves. Because enslavement of Africans by Africans also occurred in Africa, unfortunately. Did I answer your question? Mm-hmm. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope to...
I do have one more announcement. Florida Communities has an online survey. So if you go to floridacommunities.org/survey, please fill it out to give feedback about this event. Thank you.
I have one quick question.